Cool. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk to you about choices that enterprises, you all work for enterprises? Oh, good. We're in the right place. Good. We're going to talk about choices that enterprises have for evolving their authentication into advanced authentication capability, like on an enterprise-wide scope for customers as well as for employees. I'm not going to mention any technology products. I'm just going to give you the categories. Where did the categories come from? They came from my view. So this isn't necessarily an industry standard view. And some of the things that I'm going to share with you are a little bit controversial. So these are kind of, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a CISO, reformed CISO, probably is the best way to describe it. I'm retired now, but I did it 6 times. And 4 of those times, I implemented advanced authentication across the enterprise. So I have a lot of scar tissue that I'd like to share with you. I'm still active now, although I'm probably more interested in playing pickleball now than anything else, but I still do a little bit of work on the side for authentication type things. Okay, this is the advanced authentication framework. And again, it's my creation, so it's, you won't find it in literature anywhere, but it starts with MFA, and my definition of MFA is user ID password plus one other authentication factor, take your choice. And I'm specifying that because this is the controversial part. I think this is a point of demarcation, not a destination. So MFA is not something to aspire to if you're talking about this type of MFA. If you're talking about multi-factor authentication that doesn't use a password, all good. If you're talking about using a password, not so good. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So here are your choices. You can password camouflage. So password managers, single sign-on capabilities. The password's still being used underneath the covers, but you're shielding the user from the experience, right? So there's some goodness to that. The next thing is password list, big category here. Lots of choices and options, lots of different authentication techniques that you can use or authenticators. We'll talk more about that. It's based on a FIDO standard. The next is continuous behavioral-based authentication. And this kind of blows your mind from, we learned authentication as IT professionals as an event with a beginning and an end and a binary outcome, right? We all learned that, right? This basically says that authentication is a continuous process and it's not an event. More on that in a little bit. Next category is attribute privacy protection, which are steps that we can take as enterprises to protect the credentials that are used for authentication on behalf of consumers, customers, employees. And there's some breakthrough technology capabilities that are interesting to learn about, and I'll share a little bit about with you. And the last is the next generation of standards that allow interoperability. So maybe in our lifetime, we could have a single digital identity used across all assets, digital assets of any kind. It's not going to happen without that. GAIN was one that Adam mentioned earlier, and there's another one also, but the evolution is kind of interesting. So that's what I'm going to talk about in terms of the framework. Password challenges, I got to start with this. Passwords have served the enterprise really well for the last 60 years, really well. That's why it's so ubiquitous. But unfortunately, it's not passwords that's the problem, it's us. It's how we use passwords. And it's really not our fault. We have too many digital assets that we have to remember passwords for. So what do? We use the same passwords across sites. And you know what? Even security professionals do that. We all do that. And the criminals kind of figured it out, and that's why it's a fundamental problem today. So when an authentication capability is more popular with criminals than with employees and consumers, that's a pretty good indication that it's a time to think about other authentication methods. That's where we're at today. And if you want to test that, you can do this little test. Next time you get to a laptop, Anybody have a laptop? Yeah, use your favorite search engine and just type in Sentry MBA YouTube. Type in those things. Typically in this case, I got 766,000 hits. So let me explain what this is. This is a YouTube video that's created by somebody to teach you how to hack passwords. That's the purpose of this platform. So there's over 500,000 YouTube videos that teach you how to do that. Do you think this is pervasive? This is what we call credential stuffing. And it's the criminals figuring out that they don't have to break into a specific enterprise. They just take password or credentials that they have harvested from the dark web. There's 10 billion of them. And they take whatever they can get their hands on, and they apply it to websites randomly, whatever domains that they wish. They get a 2% hit. So if I have 10,000 credentials, I get 200 accounts that I own. So I sell access to the 200 accounts, or I scrape the data and I sell that. That's how I monetize it. And it's really, really easy. So this is what's happening pervasively today. If you want a second test, type in Sentry MBA, download, and it tells you all the sites where you can get free software to allow you to crack software, passwords and do credential stuffing. Now, is anything free these days? The reason is because essentially the criminals are going to sell you the credentials that you can use, and that's how they make money. So this is big business. Every single website has this problem. And the underlying issue is that we reuse passwords from one enterprise to another, and that's why this works. So it's time to move away from this, because for years, we enterprise cybersecurity professionals, guilty as charged right here, have been introducing this notion that the more sensitive the information, the higher the pain for the digital consumer. We're all guilty of this. And it's time to break this model. And that's why I don't believe in MFA, defined as using a password with a one-time password or any other authenticator on top of that, because it's the foundation that's the weakest part, and it creates friction for the end users. It's time for us to think about a different model. This is the trifecta of business benefits that you will get when you move to the left to right on the authentication framework that I showed you. The first thing you're going to get, there's no friction. Now, interesting enough, no friction means there is some friction. Why? Because we've trained users and customers for 60 years to expect pain when you authenticate. When you remove the pain, they sit there and say, wait a minute, this is too good to be true, right? It's like free, right? It's like 50% off these seats, right? I mean, there's something in there, right? But literally, it removes friction from the equation. And this is the first time we as cybersecurity professionals have ever had this opportunity. And it does cause some strange bedfellows. For instance, the cybersecurity people can actually be popular with the sales and marketing people. This is uncommon ground, right? This is awkward, right? We don't know how to handle that, right? Yeah, that's one thing that can happen. The second thing is we get rid of account takeover because there's no credentials to harvest. It goes away. And all the costs associated with that for the enterprise, no more. They go away. And for the enterprises that I work for, these were big numbers. In terms, we're talking many, many millions of dollars for an enterprise on an annualized basis to save just by removing the fraud. The third, which you may not appreciate, it's lower cost. It's lower cost because your enterprises today stand up infrastructure to support password reset. And whatever you have in place today that's automated, it's backed up by help desk calls, right? Help desk calls are expensive, right? So you take those things and eliminate the cost, your operating run rate drops by millions of dollars a year. So paying for the movement to advanced authentication is easy. It's not hard. Now, that's the business case. The actual implementation, a little higher degree of difficulty. Lots of technical challenges there. So I don't want to minimize that, but I'm just telling you, getting funding to do this, even in today's environment, it's easy. Every CFO wants to reduce their operating costs. You now have a way for them to do that. Okay, so with that in mind, here's the first choice of a category. These are password camouflage techniques. You're familiar with them. Password managers, single sign-on options, all goodness. The one thing to remember is we're still using the underlying password, right? So there's still credentials that can be harvested, right? And the top 4 password managers, what happened to them? Oh, that's right, they got hacked. Why that? Well, that's the criminals, they know where to go, right? That's where the money is, right? So that's a bit of a problem. But I want to tell you, there is no one-size-fits-all model for your enterprise. And the whole notion of doing everything for consumers and employees exactly the same, I don't know anybody doing that, all right? So the practical implementation is use your choices as you move along the spectrum, and as long as you're moving, left to right, you're headed in the right direction, and you're going to get a lot of benefit as a result of it. So the next category is passwordless. This is where we have some game-changing capability where you get the trifecta of the 3 business benefits that I talked about earlier. And that you have lots of choices on how you do this. The end of the game here is you're bound to that phone or device that you're using, the mobile device. So that's the one thing that's kind of inevitable here. And there's good news and bad news there, and most of it is good news, so it's not necessarily the worst thing in the world, but it's just something to keep in mind. And I promote all passwordless options and product capabilities simply because they get us into this game-changing situation. So you can try this yourself. There's a number of websites to do this. I just picked one. It happened to be one that was produced by the firm that's paying for my airfare out here, so I decided it might be a good idea to do that. So Bind ID, if you go to their site, you can try it out, and this is based on FIDO. By the way, there's another talk on FIDO that's really good. Andrew's doing it. It's at the same time. I hate when that happens, but see if you can maybe see the video of that afterwards. It's pretty good. So here's the step, continuous behavioral-based authentication. How many people have you ever heard of this? I'm psyched. You are my people. I like you. Really? That many? That's great. I'm glad to hear that. So the reason I'm so excited about this is because it requires data science applied in real time. Now, a little spoiler alert. If you want to talk to somebody that's actually implemented this capability across an enterprise of 50 million digital users and has the scar tissue to prove it, he's sitting right there. And so Eric, wait, just a little wave. So he's a guy that can help you talk about scar tissue on the implementation side. He looks a lot better for the wear than I thought he would, given what he's been through. However, continuous behavioral-based authentication breaks that paradigm where we have to remember that authentication is a continuous process, and it goes on behind the scenes. The consumer doesn't know it. The employee doesn't know it. Basically, it uses some advanced math that starts with this. Every behavior can be represented by a number, and every attribute can be represented by a number. So if you can turn everything into a number, you can establish a pattern. And the pattern is based on multiple attributes and how you use the technology choices that you make, whatever device, web browser, whatever it is. So that's the pattern. So if you measure data from events in real time, streaming architecture, if you measure events in real time, against the pattern, you have a deviation. And then you, the enterprise, decide where that deviation threshold is, which is the score that triggers an action, step-up authentication perhaps. And all of this runs while the digital consumer is having their experience with whatever digital asset that they're using. So there is no pain whatsoever, there's no friction of any kind, and it's a continual method, and hackers can't beat this yet. Because there's so many different, if you use 30, 40 attributes, and you change that, even if a hacker broke into the risk engine, they wouldn't be able to defeat this. So there's only two that I'm aware of, 2 or 3 choices in the market today that for products that do this, but you're going to see more coming soon, I'm certain of it. Next category is attribute privacy protection. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's a technology breakthrough that represents a real game changer for all of us, and this is the category that's in. Right now, there's only one company that does this, and I don't know how long that's going to be, but for now, you have one choice. What we're doing here is we're protecting the attribute information. Now, if you think about it, the attribute information of whatever credentials that are being used, that's the most sensitive part from the consumer's perspective and from the enterprise's perspective in protecting the consumer interest. And there's quite a bit of tension there between the two. The consumer really doesn't want you to have that data, but they recognize it's necessary. And of course, you want to protect that data, but you also want to use that data, and some enterprises want to sell that data. So there's tension there relative to attributes. If whoever the identity authority is, there's a lot of tension there as well in terms of the handling of the credential information. And so if we can eliminate the credential or credentials being stored anywhere, that would be a real breakthrough. Do you agree? Yeah, right? Well, there's technology that allows us to do that. And to be specific, it's actually back to math. It's advanced crypto that basically creates a private key from a public key across any device in any situation, and it eliminates the storing of credential information by any issuing entity or enterprise. It eliminates the need for credentials to be stored anywhere. Sound pretty interesting, huh? Yeah, this is game-changing kind of capability. Now, this technology will only work with interoperability standards that define the rules of the road that allow each of us as consumers to have a single digital identity used across all digital assets. So this is something called ADI, which is Accountable Data Identity, and it's based on a model of the directory of services that provides information to issuers and service providers, and essentially that digital ID can be provided by directory services out to both issuers and service providers without friction, and the accountability model follows the life cycle of the digital identity. So you essentially, when you're born, you have some documentation. When you come of age, you have some documentation. When you get a passport, you have some documentation. All of these things are built into your accountable digital identity, and it's the same concept as what we heard in the keynote of essentially having a single digital identity to be used anywhere. So this is, FIDO took 10 years to develop. This is the next generation FIDO, and some of the same people that are worked and created FIDO are part of this. GAIN was the other organization, is that fair? Yeah, collective that's really pushing the same mission. I mentioned to Adam earlier, I'm really interested in learning more about GAIN because I'm kind of agnostic to where the standards are. I just hope that there are standards that give us interoperability that ultimately get us to a point of single digital ID that can be used anywhere. So that's where the advanced authentication framework comes from. And what I'm trying to encourage you to do, if you didn't get the hint, head into the green boxes, and do it like, there's not one way to do it. There's not one product to do it. Do it in the way that makes sense for your enterprise, where you are. And if you have to do if you have to have some password camouflage capability, that's fine, that's cool. There is no one model here. Just remember, if you're moving from the point of demarcation, which is MFA based on passwords, to maybe a broader MFA with no passwords, and moving left to right on the curve here, then you're gaining in capability, gaining in maturity, but it's also a little bit higher degree of difficulty because it's new technology that you're dealing with, and scaling that across an enterprise is a big challenge. That's what we heard in the keynote. So if you want more information on this, I don't work for a company anymore, really, so I can share all the slides with you. You can send me an email. I'm happy to do that. Jeremy, I didn't recognize you with your mask on. How are you, bro? Thanks for, yeah, thanks. Do you have legs, too? Do you have well, on Zoom, how do you know? Right? There, he's got legs. I'm impressed. All right. All right. Look, I hope this was helpful for you, and I'm going to wrap up now. I'll hang out for a little bit if you have any questions about this, and have a great conference. Really appreciate you being here in person. It's a good experience. Thank you very much.